You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Welcome back to TFM's Books and Comics show here for Star Trek, and I am just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing. And this week, as he is pretty much every week, is Chris Jones with me as we've got some comic reviews to do here in the news.
Yeah, hey Matthew, it's good to be back, and I'm glad that we have the final part of the 7 of 9 comic to talk about. You know, getting ready to talk about it today, the main thing on my mind is I'm just wondering, how did I end up back here in sickbay? How did I get here?
Yeah, it was strange. I didn't realize how I got there either, but we are back in sickbay, of course, and we're going to be covering the Seven's Reckoning issue 4 as it's wrapping up the series. So that's going to be fun. And then, of course, we've got in our feature section, Bruce is back with us as we're continuing our 24th century talk of books where we dive into Titan again. But this time we're back with Synthesis. So that's going to be a lot of fun. But so, Chris, we've been reading this series and like issue 4 is here. We're wrapping it up. Issue 3 didn't seem to do too much for either of us. So how do you feel like, issue 4 did with bringing this story to a close?
Oh, well, that's a big question.
Well, I get paid nothing, so...
Yeah, I don't know. Like, there's some important messages and important commentary in issue 4 of this comic. In terms of it wrapping up the story... I felt let down at the end, especially the final page, the final bit of dialogue. Mm-hmm. It just didn't feel like the kind of closure that I would expect from something entitled Seven's Reckoning. Although right. I do understand how it ties into the title, it just felt very weak to me.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I didn't feel like this was as strong of a story as I would have thought there would be for a story about Seven coming to a reckoning with her individuality and, who she is and who basically she wants to be. And I mean, coming to a reckoning of, now living in this new type of life, obviously, and getting used to Starfleet rules and regulations and everything. And so, I do agree. It just felt lacking in the story because it just didn't ever really seem to gel with Seven. Like, that this is a story that we needed to tell for Seven specifically. I almost feel like, in all honesty, it could have been like a Harry Kim story. Because, he's younger, he's an ensign, this kind of story could have, I feel like, happened to him. It could have happened to many people on Voyager, really. I don't think it necessarily just has to be Seven. I think that's what I was kind of hoping for, and we just, I don't know, it just never panned out that way.
Yeah, I don't know if I completely agree with that. I agree that it could happen to the other characters. It does feel, though, like the kind of thing Seven might do, where, she has this tendency to just take charge and go do her own thing, like whatever she feels is right in the moment. That was sort of a struggle between her and Janeway throughout the series. Sure. So in that respect, I think it does fit her character fairly well. What I didn't really understand in the first parts, especially in maybe the first and second part, is why she was so concerned with the situation of these other people who she had never met before. And I thought that, well, maybe it's going to come back to the idea that she was part of the collective, and then she got her individuality, her freedom. And so she doesn't want to see other people sort of enslaved in that environment where they have no control over their own lives. And it did come back to that, and she did say that. So it does make sense to me for it to be a 7 story. I just feel like the payoff was very low key, for what they were setting up.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that wholeheartedly. And I mean, it was interesting here because, we've been dealing with this race that their whole framework is stories, and the stories that they tell and the story that they're involved in. And what I really kind of took from the comic overall, which it had less to do with 7 and more just to do thematically, was, this idea of being so sold out to a narrative regardless of what evidence might come against that, right? So a life narrative, you continually live by this basically worldview, right? This worldview narrative. They have a narrative understanding of the universe, and they're a part of it, and whatever, and this worldview specifically has them entrenched, and they're pretty antithetical to the idea that anything should get in the way of that, even when faced with evidence to the contrary. And that, it really struck as obviously a key to our world of too many people kind of living in false narratives and or being willing to believe narratives without any real true good evidence. So I liked that. I thought that was really good. But again, that didn't quite have anything to do with 7. So there's a juxtaposition here for me. I don't really love this as a 7 story, but I really thought that the narrative thought and train of thought that we were on with the alien species was really fascinating, and classic Star Trek in that way. Yeah.
The story is more about the alien species here, and 7 has been injected into it, I think, because if it's a Voyager comic, her connection back to the collective is sort of the catalyst for telling a story about another species that's being oppressed in some way. But as an individual 7 story, I was going to say she's not like at the center of the story, but she is at the center of the story, visually anyway, in the comic. But she's not at the center of the story in terms of the actual story itself. I think that's probably what we both feel. What you said about the false narratives, that's what I took from it as well. And maybe in a timely way, there are people who live in these false narratives their whole lives because they're indoctrinated into something early on, when they're young. And so they just always believe that. And then there are people who are led astray by false narratives and get lost in it. And we see that in the world today as well. So I feel a bit like the social commentary element of this comic may be about the current world, specifically, not just about, human nature in general. And then the one thing that caught my attention was Septa, who's like the grand leader, saying that we have reached the end of this narrative, and it is time for us to return to our previous sojourn. And in one of the earlier comics, they talked about how the narratives work in their society. And so Septa's saying, we've reached the end of this narrative. It's like, this story's over. Now we go back to the other one. And that made me think about the current situation in the world, specifically in the US, and how there are a lot of people who do believe like, okay, we've reached the end of that narrative and now we're just going to go back. And the world isn't really that simple. And only parts of that narrative maybe have reached some sort of conclusion, but other parts, other threads of that plot are ongoing. Right. And I don't know if that was the intention in the writing, but that certainly stood out to me.
Well, and it's also fascinating to me as well because, this really seems to be a story of, free speech too, because, here we see that anything that challenges the narrative in a way that those in power don't like is shut down. And I mean, I can't think of a bigger issue, I mean, the answer to speech you don't like is not shutting it down. It's more speech to explain why that speech isn't correct.
It's dialogue.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and this is the thing I think that is really frustrating that we see in our world, and it's obviously really frustrating for the story here, and it's something that Seven is definitely having a hard time with, which is realizing, this she can't rectify just this moment as to, if we believe something to be better, why wouldn't it be better for everyone? Which, is a good and interesting Star Trek story, and it makes for great, I think, philosophical conversation as to why, we wouldn't want to help people see it. If something was, truly better, we think it's better for these reasons, again, why wouldn't even just having a dialogue about that? So it is, I mean, there's some fascinating stuff here, I think, thematically, but it's mostly divorced from Seven, which is strange.
Yeah, it is. And even in this one, the stuff you were just talking about right there, Janeway is like the steady hand through the end of the story where she's trying to ground the situation and ground Seven in her role as a Starfleet crew member. And she brings up the Prime Directive, which I think wouldn't really apply in this situation. But her point about letting other cultures develop on their own course is why she brought it up. And that's what Seven is struggling with. And of course is what you're talking about there. So
I kind of wondered, since we've kind of reached the end of this series, if you were going to rate the comic, since we've read the whole series now, where do you think you'd go with this one?
Okay. Rating comics is difficult. I have two thoughts on this one. If I'm rating it as a comic, I'm just looking at the artwork. I'm looking at the voice in the writing. I thought that the characters' voices were very well written. And, Janeway was true to herself here. I would probably give it maybe 3 out of 4 strange, tiny statues. But if I'm rating the story itself and how satisfied I feel, I probably drop it down to 2 out of 4.
Yeah. I think that's good, because for me, overall, I think this comic, I was, out of 5 is 2.5 out of 5. There's some good things in there, but unfortunately, I feel like it doesn't live up to the promise to which the comic seems to make at the beginning, which is to be really about Seven.
Yeah, so, that's the key.
So, Chris, I mean, really fun, of course, the fact that we got a chance to, talk through this, and very excited, now to dive into our feature with Bruce as we talk about Titan synthesis.
Yeah, great to have Bruce back on.
This week, we had mentioned this a few weeks back, that this was going to be happening, and really excited to welcome back the one, the only, the incredible, nay, should I say wonderful, Bruce Gibson.
Wow, you got that all correct. Very good, Matt.
That'll be $20.
I'll throw another 5 in because you did it so well.
Oh man, that's great. That's great. Well, no, I'm so excited that you're going to be back here with us, and you're going to be talking through. We're going to be looking at you and Dan had been doing the 24th Century books and going through that whole series, all the ones that we hadn't covered. And you had started all the way back from Destiny and moving forward. I mean, guys, I think you even did before that, didn't you? Because you started with a Time 2 series, right?
Oh, gosh, yeah, we did. We started with a Time 2 series, and we just kept going from there. I mean, we were actually just going to do a Time 2, and then we thought, well, let's just keep going. And that's what we did.
Well, and part of that is there were so many great books in that era, too. I mean, to me, that's what I kind of consider the I Ching of Star Trek books, really. It really took off then. And part of that is because, Nemesis, they weren't going to do any more films, and so they pretty much had carte blanche to do whatever they want. So it was pretty great. And so I'm really excited to be continuing this with you. So glad to have you back. So we're going to be doing this. Bruce and I also have a few surprises. We're gonna work in another series as well. But basically, this just means you're going to be getting more Literary Treks episodes. Chris and I will still be doing some. Bruce and I are going to do some. And this will allow you guys to have just more opportunity to enjoy Literary Treks. So this week, our book that we're covering, which is Titan Synthesis, which is really exciting to me because, obviously, Bruce, we both just read the brand new book by James Swallow, where he was writing the Titan now in canon. And so it was really fun to come back to a James Swallow Titan book and dive back into that. And so I was going to ask you, before we even kind of dive into the book, can you kind of sum up at all where Titan is at this point as we reach this book? Because this one is right after Destiny, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's okay. So there was Destiny, and then we had another book after that.
Oh, Under the Torrent, or Over the Torrent Sea, right?
Over the Torrent Sea,
yeah.
Which I think was the last book that Dan and I did on Literary Treks.
Yes. So they're still, I mean, at this point, we're still kind of reeling with everything that's happened in the Destiny trilogy, and it's still obviously very fresh on the mind, which is fascinating because this book really is all about AI and its potential, what it can do, what it maybe can't do, what are its limitations, and all of that. And so I found it really fascinating that the writers here, and James specifically, decided to really challenge the Titan crew with something that I think, for them is frightening because they've had this massive experience with the Borg. And now, I mean, I would say this book finally puts to test all of the things I've thought of with AI and Star Trek in this story.
It does. And if anything, I was reading this, I was like, James Swallow's a smart guy, but now I really think he's a smart guy. Because, I mean, this is just very deep and in-depth, and I think this probably tackles AI more so than any other Star Trek book I've read.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, so one of the things that this book really brought to mind, obviously we've dealt with the ideas of the Borg, and they're still reeling from that, but when we think about how smart Star Trek computers are, I mean, they even bring up the fact in this book that Star Trek computers have basically been held back from becoming sentient, because they're so advanced, it could happen. And of course, it does happen in this book to where the point where Titan's main computer becomes a person by confluence of events. And so to me, it was fascinating because, we see holograms, obviously, we've seen AI with data, and even the idea of these super smart computers, like a ship's computer is, we really realize how, Star Trek has always kind of been on the edge of this happening. And I thought it was interesting because James just finally deals with it straight up, where we are in Star Trek, and I guess the one, I don't know if you call it the tipping point or the danger zone here for where our technology can go if we don't actually, rein it in.
Well, you think about even in the original series, the earliest series that was made, the computer does talk. I mean, there are voice commands and it relays information back to you. And we do that now on our phones. I have an iPhone and I say, hey, Siri. Okay, good. Oh, wait, it's waiting for a question from me now. But, I mean, and we're in the early part of the 21st century. And we already have that. And there's a part of me that thinks with Siri and Alexa and all these things that we have, at some point, what will it be like in 200, 300 years? Is it just something that responds to our commands, or does it take on its own type of life? And it makes so much sense if you think of it in that context of where we are today and where we could be in a few hundred years. You would almost have to hold the technology back, because it could become a sentient being, and then, you would have to make it free. It wouldn't be under your command anymore. And which is also a whole nother parallel of, well, does the machinery become slaves to the human race at that point? And us holding it back, is that the right moral thing to do or not?
Yeah, what's really fascinating to me is that this book came out the same year that the movie Her did. And I don't know if you ever saw that, with Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson as the voice of the technology. But
I know of the movie. I can't remember if I've seen it, though.
So, but the whole point of that technology, or that movie, is that he falls in love with his phone, his operating system. But the operating system gets to the point where she's transcended the ability to really give him what he needs, one, because she's not a physical being whatsoever. And so there's never any of that type of intimacy. But even intellectually, she surpasses him because she has the ability to think and comprehend and all of these different things in a way that human beings can't. She is interfacing with so much information that, a human being doesn't have that ability. And so I just thought it was really interesting that we're kind of playing with this idea of the Titan as a person. And, it takes the form of Minuet, which reminded me so much of that idea of this movie Her, where that same kind of thing almost happens, except that, it never has a holographic presence. So it was just really interesting that in culture at the time, you're dealing with this question of, like, what happens if technology becomes so advanced that you could, like, have a relationship with your phone, because the person could give you that intellectual stimuli that you need. And like you said here, like, this is the thing that Star Trek is always skirted the issue of, and this book just kind of takes head on, is, well, if your AI can become sentient, like, is it wrong to not make it all of it sentient? Is it right to kind of hold it back? And then, like, you're dealing with all these really crazy ethical questions, which, I don't really know any of the answers to. And I think what was fascinating about this book is that James basically, I think, pushes it as far as it can go without it becoming to the point where you'd be like, well, you kind of ruin the magic, like, Star Trek is meant to be entertainment and too. And if you push this question too far, it's like you start to get a little bit, like, uncomfortable. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And what's interesting too is what you were saying about, evolving. We're in Star Trek always meeting other races and wanting them and encouraging them to evolve. We encourage Data to evolve. We've encouraged the AIs in this book to evolve, except we hold back the creations that we made from evolving. So it's like those things that we didn't create or in control of, we want to evolve, but those that we do create, we hold back. I mean, if you think about the ship wants to evolve, but we have prevented it, meaning Starfleet has.
Yeah.
And, the whole Minuet thing, you would think that Riker would fall in love again with Minuet because he's in love with his ship. And I think there's a part of them that kind of wanted to. But, he's in love with Deanna Troi, of course. But that would be an interesting situation, too. But the character, I just want to specify one thing.
He really loves his ship.
He really loves the ship. But they don't go there. James Swallow doesn't go there with Minuet. Minuet is really not a character in this book. The ship is. Right. The ship is just using the image of Minuet.
Well, and what's so fascinating is it also kind of plays with the ideas that you saw in the obviously the comic series and of course the manga movie with Ghost in the Shell, and like consciousness that is there, but it needs to be housed in something. We see that kind of play out with Titan and as well as with the Sentries that we have, and we'll talk about them in a second, but, one of the things I thought was so interesting is that I really love the argument that White, Blue, and Vale have, because they both have really valid points, and that James does a great job of showing both sides of the argument here, but she does a very good job of explaining, the worry that humanity has, because you've got V'ger or the Daystrom's M5 or the Moriarty hologram, and like the list just keeps going on and on of like things that have happened which have turned very badly for humanity, right? And so and James has even talked about this before with us, with this idea of like we always see sci-fi go to basically it's going to turn into Skynet. And the point is it doesn't always have to happen, right? And so I think this is his version of that, right? Things can go really wrong, but they could also go really right.
Yeah, I think if something goes wrong, it doesn't mean we can't get it right the next time. Not every situation an AI is going to go wrong or be dangerous. We just maybe have to be cautious with it. Even when you look at Picard and, the synths and what's happened there, of course, someone obviously messed with them and did something to them. But, it's always something new that we have to be careful and take small steps and letting it to evolve and see what direction it's going to go.
So you're saying we need baby steps?
We need baby steps. Okay. AI baby steps.
AI baby steps. One of the things that we see, though, with the AI here is that we have this whole other side, because we run into this group of sentient machines known as the Sentries, and they've been on this mission, and they have this inability to transcend their programming, and yet they have their emotions. And what I love, this question of like, what they would be without the emotions, and one of them tells Tuvok, we would simply be machinery. And to me, it was just a really interesting question then about in some ways, is that an answer to the question of like, what does it take to be sentient, and that you need emotion? It's not just cold, hard logic, right? Even Vulcans with all their logic still have emotion. And so that, and that emotion then is something that transforms us because of the way it shapes our experiences too. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And they James really created, I thought, really interesting new race here with the Sentries. And I think took them in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. I've read this book before, but even rereading it after all these years, I think he does such a great job of giving us a really complicated and nuanced race of beings, and especially even just the way they've had to kind of engineer themselves throughout the years to continue on this mission, and that it's created this much more machine. They still have machine-like thoughts and understanding of the world, and yet again, it's much more nuanced because they have emotion as well.
But they also have a one-track mind because they were programmed to do one thing. So it's an odd situation to me that they just seem to have one goal, one-track mind of what they're doing, and that is, to fight the Null, and we'll get to that, of course. But where do the emotions come in? Because don't emotions then create certain ambitions and wanting to do something different and not just always do the one thing that you've been programmed to do?
I mean, I think that's a really great question. And I would say that one of the things that I kind of saw that went along with the Sentries that kind of kept them from being able to do that was that they weren't grounded in the truth. The truth of their existence is that they did not create themselves, that they had been created, that they had a purpose in that creation, and therefore they had locked themselves into not being able to transcend their programming because they had told themselves that they had created themselves. And therefore, because of that truth not being there, they would never be able to get over the hump, you know? Like, and this was really interesting to me because in the end, it really showed the need to be grounded in the truth, to truly know what our history is, you know, because those foundational truths we build our lives on are the keys of where we can go, you know, and how we can evolve, right? And so they don't have a true understanding of what their history is, what their existence is, and that has stymied them in not being able to evolve, really.
Well, and it reminds me of the 4-issue Voyager comic that just released its last issue this past month, and that's Seven's Reckoning. And it's the same thing there. There's an alien race that doesn't really know its true history or has been lied to about its history, and they've been playing out a certain way because of what they believe their history was. And now it comes into question as to whether that was really true or not. What is the truth? Some believe one way, some believe in the other. And now you've got this machinery which is reacting the same way as an alien sentient being would react. And it's, you know, this is the history that has been formed. This is their perception of reality. And so they're playing out that reality. And of course, in typical Star Trek ways, we have to come in and kind of upset that and show them maybe what the truth is, or have them question it, or take it into a different direction and how they perceive things. But, you know, this machinery also appears differently. They don't look the same all the time. Their souls, I guess you could say, can take parts in other machinery that's around. So they've evolved beyond their bodies. They're really souls. They're souls that really don't have a specific body to them.
Yeah, I love that, again, because it kind of plays into that whole idea of the same thing we see with the Titan, where you just it's the ghost in the shell, right? Like this ability to inhabit these other places and these other machines, and in the end, one of the things that they do want is the ability to be able to have a more permanent form, and a form that allows them to in many ways, they want that synthesis of what you see Titan be able to have. You know, the form that they could transform into anything, but wow, can you imagine all of these things with, you know, mobile emitters, you know? Right. You know, but that's I really think, again, James is getting so deep here of what it like reality, like what is reality for them. But what I find most interesting is that their reality is hampered and their ability to evolve is stymied because they don't know the truth of their existence. And once they know the truth, it's really Troy who's kind of helped them be able to see, look, you have this programming, you have this directive. You can complete that directive, and then you get to figure out what you want to do next. Then your path is open, you know, but it's only really by kind of knowing the truth and having it set them free that they have that ability to realize, yeah, we can complete our programming. Because beforehand, too, them not knowing the truth of who they are has kept them from truly completing their mission, because their mission is all they have. That is their existence, right? And again, Troy helps them see, like, no, you can complete the programming you were given by this race years and years and, however many eons ago. And then you can forge a new path. And it's really, really fascinating.
But then if you complete the programming, and to your point, eons and eons ago, they've been doing the same thing for so long. Do they really want to complete the programming?
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's their purpose. And if you complete it, then the purpose is taken away. So what is their purpose in life? Do they want to continue on? Do they want to do something different? Mm-hmm. They don't know how to think in that manner.
Yeah.
They won't know how to think, okay, what now? What do we do now? Like, hey, what are our hopes and dreams? What do we want different in life? They've never had to think like that. I mean, this book actually really calls for a sequel to it. I'd love to go back and see what happens to them.
No, I mean, because you're absolutely right. What we're drilling down to in the idea of like sentience here is that whole thought process of, being able to find meaning and purpose and just determine what that is for you, right? And the fact that can they do that? And it is a really big question. And like you said, we kind of see them begin to do that, but I would love to see this followed up on. Because there's so much depth to this. One of the other really interesting things in the book, and it really, there's a lot of prejudice and bias in this book from both sides. And I was like, there's a lot of Pride and Prejudice going on here. And the Sentries, they look down on the organics. The Starfleet crew are kind of worried about the Sentries in light of their experience with the Borg. And I really thought that this was interesting because it goes to show how difficult it can be to trust people. And in the end, I would say that this whole section, this idea of like this kind of this pride and this prejudice that they both have, it all comes down to them learning to trust one another, and especially how difficult that can be when our experiences show us how badly it can go. I mean, like Tuvok even says in the book that we cannot allow our past experiences with other machine life forms to color our interactions with these AIs, and how difficult that is. Like, so good, because what he's saying is that just because somebody seems similar to somebody that you've met before, you cannot judge them until you get to really truly know them. And a perfect message for these days.
Absolutely. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about baby steps. You can't just judge from the one experience. You need to let the other experience or the other AI evolve and see where that's going to go. And in addition to that, when meeting something like this, when meeting an AI or these Sentries, you can't just assume that they're going to be like the Borg. It's not always going to be the same. I mean, you can look at these things and know that they're not Borg. I mean, Borg is a blend between, organic life and these machinery put together and to assimilate. And this technology is not looking to assimilate. And so, yeah, you do have to go in there, and you have to always remind yourself of those. It's so easy as humans or Vulcans or whatever to have those prejudices at first, but you have to recognize it. You have to realize, this other being reminds me of this, but they're not that. But it's okay to go in there and be a little skeptical and look at it and go, well, just, let me make sure. But don't close the door on it, because you'll never move forward and discover something new and help somebody else out if you're just always assuming something is the way you think it's going to be. You need to find out what it's going to be.
Yeah, I really like that, Bruce, because it really reminds me of what Riker says to Vale. And he said, everything that happened to the Federation, our showdown with the Borg, everything and everyone we lost, all that does not change our ideals. It does not change who we are and why we're out here. And that really struck me because I feel as though, that's obviously the hallmark of Star Trek, right? Is to judge everyone by their own actions. And it's such a message that, as I was reading that, I was thinking how sad it is that I feel like our world has just lost that ability. Like, we just start painting with these very broad brushstrokes, and anybody who kind of fits in any kind of category, we just label them, and then it allows us to treat them in a certain way. And that's exactly what, Riker and Tuvok here are saying, is that, like, we can't do that. Because then we would, as Riker says, we would not be living up to our ideals. And that becomes an issue. And I just thought that was really good.
I mean, that's why Starfleet is out there, exploring strange new worlds, new civilizations. I mean, we could just sit at home, but it's about learning. It's discovering something more. And by learning and discovering more, you learn and discover more about yourself. And this is the opportunity to do that, where the Sentries only have that one-track mind. So in a lot of ways, once they complete their goal, now they have the opportunity to do such things. And they can't judge every being that they meet and think it's going to be like the Titan crew either, So they have to keep that in mind too. But that's how we evolve. And yeah, this does parallel a lot of things in our society today. It feels like it is becoming so black and white and right or wrong or left and right or whatever. And it's more complex than that. There's not categories. Everything's so different. And you need to just learn what that thing is and appreciate the differences and learn about yourself from those differences and understand why people are the way they are based on what their experiences are. And you don't know where they're coming from unless you talk to them. And that's the thing that we, learn from Star Trek. That's what it's all about. It's getting to know the other person and learning from them and them learning from you. It's self-discovery. That's why Star Trek Discovery is such a great title. That could apply to any Star Trek series.
Getting to know you. Anyway, it's funny because Deanna says that same kind of thing, that the Avatar, that Titan, was the best of both of them. The best of the organics, the best of the Sentries, that she was that synthesis of both of us. And in the end, isn't that the beauty of what Star Trek is meant to be, which is that we take us all together and we make something beautiful out of it, right? The Federation is a hodgepodge of people from thousands of different worlds that all believe totally, crazy things compared to the other, and yet they find a way to learn from one another and work together to create something beautiful. It's kind of the promise of what America is supposed to be, right? Just speaking of the country we live, that's what it's meant to be, which is this synthesis of all of us together creating something together. And I really liked the way that Troy puts that, because obviously it's the title of the book, which is always fun. But it is the truth of the synthesis. We're supposed to bring ourselves together and learn from one another. And I think, that's kind of something that I saw with the story with one of the Sentries, White Blue, this whole idea of kind of getting to know your quote unquote enemy. And he even admits this, of having made errors in dealing with the Federation, because he just applied his own cultural standards to an alien society, and it was incorrect. And what that really was getting at is, to me, it's like, we have to get to know one another. We're all going to come at things from our own prejudices, our own biases, and the whole point is to try and put those aside and get to know the actual person. And then because the only true way to judge people is by their actions. The only true way to judge people is by what they do, not what they say. And the best way to be able to do that is to truly get to know people. And I thought I really liked that theme here in this book.
Yeah, White Blue is moving a little too fast in this relationship, making himself a little too comfortable. But yeah, it's, he perceives how he would interact with someone or how he would expect someone to interact with him. So when he gets with the ship and with this crew, he's trying to help, but it's almost like he's helping too much because they're not ready for that, or that's going beyond the boundaries, that he's crossed the line. And I mean, that's why we had this avatar, because once he tapped into the ship, he thought, oh, well, here, I'll help the ship become more sentient. And, I'll give the ship that ability. I mean, wouldn't everybody want that? Don't you crew want that? And it's like, no, you didn't ask us that. We purposely were holding it back, which is such a hard conversation. How do you tell this being that we're holding this other being as it perceives back? It's like, it almost would think that White Blue would think that they're evil, holding the ship back. But
well, and I think, that's the thing. Like, one of the most important aspects of this is that until you truly get to know somebody and kind of put yourself in their shoes, it's difficult to be able to understand what their reasoning for something might be. And that's what we see, the Federation and the Sentries doing throughout this story, which is wrestling with this. And obviously it's very difficult because they come at it with such amazing prejudices against one another. And they have to overcome those, but two, then they truly have to work to understand one another, and where each other is coming from. And I think what's great about the book is the way that they are obviously able to do that in the story, and part of that is because they have to put aside those biases. And at the same time, they have to learn to that there's a leap of faith when you trust, right? In Man of Steel, the priest says that to Clark Kent. He's like, when it comes to trust, there's a leap of faith, and somebody has to take that leap of faith first, and then the trust part comes later, but it's by taking that leap of faith. And I think what's beautiful here is that we see these characters, the Federation and the Sentries, really struggling with this idea of taking that leap of faith. But once they finally do, they're able to forge a relationship, and they're able to get to know each other much better. And part of that is because they can begin then to also see one another for who they truly are.
Well, and there's some Sentries that more easily accept our Starfleet crew than others. It takes others quite a while, and some don't even really come around at the end, and some of them die in the battle with the Null. But it takes some people longer than others. And it also takes, one to convince the other that, these Starfleet crew people, these humans and Vulcans and such, are not bad people, and there's some significance to them. They're just not these cogs in the machine. They, they're life, just like they think they themselves are. So it takes some of the Sentries to convince the other Sentries, and then some of the Sentries don't believe or don't come around to that. Well, that's the complexity of any society.
Well, and like you said too, one of the most interesting things is the Sentries themselves realizing that they do have to evolve, otherwise they're going to die. And part of that is this there's a lot of unintended consequences that have happened in this story, because the creators of the Sentries years ago their desire had been to create gateways, much like we've seen in Star Trek before. And in doing so, they opened up space to the Null. And so by trying to create something, they have this consequence of accidentally opening space to the Null. And at the same time, the Sentries FTL drives also are continuing to weaken this area of space. And it really, it kind of brought to mind to me, especially, from the creators of the Sentries, it's like that whole Jurassic Park thing, where Malcolm's like, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
Yeah, I love that line.
And it's very true here, because that's exactly what happens. Their desire is not necessarily a bad one, but their experimentation, and I think this goes all the way back with, the whole idea of like, creating AIs and everything and the dangers involved around there. Like, we have to constantly be aware of the repercussions of what could happen with the creations that we're making, and the good and bad ramifications as much as possible that could happen with that. And so I thought that was, again, this book has got so many deep themes in it, but this is another huge one.
And not only that, but it seems like AIs always seem to outlive their creators. And that's what happens here, because those beings that created these gateways aren't around anymore. And yet the AIs, the Sentries, continue the fight, continue to do what their programming says. And, we don't really know the whole story about why they created the gateways or what went wrong. I mean, obviously it let the Null out, but you can't fault them for trying to create new ways to travel or to explore new things. I mean, that's what we do as Starfleet. I keep referring to Starfleet as we. Like, I feel like we're part of Starfleet, right? I mean, we do Star Trek podcasts. Aren't we Starfleet? I feel like we are.
But I think it's interesting, because what it brings to mind is obviously the absolute importance for us then to plan for the future, to plan well, and to understand how we live in the present will impact the future. And again, I think rightly so, it does mean that we must be aware of what we're creating and how it could impact our present as well as our future. I kind of think of, just as an example, I don't think that anybody ever thought about, and having the documentary, The Social Dilemma, nobody thought about the implications of creating the technologies we have for social media, right? They weren't trying to do anything bad. They were just trying to create a way for people to be able to communicate with one another and all of those type of things. And yet there have been a ton of unintended consequences to that, because, nobody really did sit down and think about, in some ways, what's the worst case scenario? And
having never done that, you may not have any idea what the worst case scenario is.
Exactly. So I think what it shows is the complexity, of all of these types of things. So to me, it's just really fascinating. But one of the things I think before we kind of, talk about any ratings, Bruce, I'm really interested in what you thought of the Null. Because this is the thing to which we're kind of fighting the whole time.
Yeah, I'm really trying to get to understand what the Null is. I mean, it's obviously this being that is crossing through subspace and these dimensions, and I don't really know what its purpose is, what it's trying to achieve by just going through and trying to destroy things. I did message with James Swallow yesterday kind of about the Null. And I also found out, not through him, but I questioned him on this later, that he used the Null in some of his Doctor Who stories.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And I think it was in 2 of them. But I asked him about it, and he said that one reason he used it is because the Null can go through subspace, so it could cross universes. Mm-hmm. And he also thinks the name is cool. So that's another reason he went with the Null in Doctor Who. but I'd like to know more about it. It was almost like that's the bad guy of this the story. So it's like one dimensional because we don't really get to know the Null. We just know it's destroying everything.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder how James would feel about this, and I probably will end up asking him, or maybe if he listens, he can let us know. But the Null, it's this thing of insatiable hunger, right? Like its desire is just to continue to feed, right? And there's a part of me that wonders if that is just basically meant to be metaphorical, which is the insatiable desire of exploration, the insatiable desire of creation that we have as beings can have a dark side to it. And I wonder if that has anything to do with the Null itself and what it means for the story. And the fact that I think in many ways we are constantly then having to fight against that, right? This kind of insatiable appetite that if does run rampant, it can completely destroy everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm starting to wonder now, too, if the Null, to your point, has some kind of hunger and came through subspace with that hunger and would have left, but then when it's being attacked by the Sentries, now it's in fighting mode. And all it's ever known about the Sentries is once it comes through, it wants to destroy. And it doesn't think anything beyond that. It's almost like coming to a hornet's nest and you're, just going to, I guess run away from the hornets or fight them or whatever, but you're not going to really think anything of it except that, oh, these are dangerous and I've got to do something about it. So I'm going to destroy them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. This book has so many thematical layers to it, which is one of the things I think I loved about it. And, again, just the fact that, you could take this villain as just being one-dimensional, but I do think that James is using it to say something more. And it almost reminds me of two, and maybe this isn't the case, but I remember in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and, Spalko is wanting to know more, right? Like, she just continually wants to know more. And then, Indy knows at that moment, at the end of the movie, to get out of there. He realizes that there is a point to which knowing more isn't always better. Sometimes enough is enough. And I kind of wonder if, the Null has this sensational desire, this appetite that can never be filled, that would just basically continue to eat everything in its path, that is there a point when enough is enough? And how do we figure out when that is? It's a really good question. It's a really philosophical question too. So, but it's perfect for Star Trek.
Right. That's what it's all about, right?
So, Bruce, I'm really fascinated to see what you end up rating then Titan Synthesis.
That's a very good question. So this is the second time I've read it. The first time was when it first came out, and now this time. And I think I liked it even more this time than I did the first time. I'm even liking it more now that we're talking through it. See, the first time I read it, I didn't get to talk to anybody about it. And now hearing what your thoughts are and hearing what you've had to say, and then it gets me thinking about things. That's what I love about Star Trek when it's on its best. So I'm going to say this is on its best. I'm going to say that I'm going to give this one, because first of all, I love seeing the Titan crew. I love playing in this continuity. And I love the writing of James Swallow. And I also like how White Blue continues on with the crew. He joins the Titan crew, and we'll see White Blue in future Titan novels. So that's pretty cool too. So everything that we've just said, I'm going to give this 4.75 out of 5 Sentries who get along with the Titan crew, but that 1/4 Sentry just cannot seem to get along.
Yeah, I mean, I am right there with you. I haven't read this book since it came out in 2013, and I found myself, I think, probably like it even more now, and I'd just give this a straight up 5 out of 5 planet-sized machines because I couldn't find anything I didn't like about it. Like, there's literally nothing in this book there I thought to myself, I really enjoyed the way all of the plot lines really worked together. I thought it was really interesting and really fun to read. And, again, my favorite thing is when something really is making me think thematically. And James does not hold back with the thematic elements in this book. So I really loved it.
And the cover makes it look like it's a romance novel.
It does kind of make it look like a Harlequin romance novel. So I would definitely give the stamp of approval to the cover.
Yes, even though the cover really is not what's inside the book.
No, not at all.
So, Matt, it was great being back here on Literary Treks. I've been listening since episode 1. Of course, then I became one of the co-hosts for a while, and now here I'm back doing some more books with you. And I have to say, you've done a very good job keeping the place clean.
Well, I appreciate it, Bruce. It's been easy. I've got some help. Chris helps out as well, and we hired White Blue. He's really good at keeping things clean around here. So, and it gave him a purpose. So, but
I also see that. I also see that Dayton is still passed out in the green room, so that's pretty cool too.
Well, I mean, I just didn't have the heart to kick him out. It's Dayton. He's been there for eons now. So
it smells like it too.
We love you, Dayton. But we're really thank you guys so much for listening to us. Of course, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. So make sure you're subscribed, and you'll get the podcast as soon as it drops. You can give us a star rating review over there on Apple Podcasts, and that really does help the show grow. I want to say a huge thank you to our associate producers, Greg Rosier and Casey Petit, for their support of the TFM network as well as Literary Treks. Now, they do that through Patreon, and Patreon is the place where if you love what we do here on TFM, we really need your help. Honestly, it's a huge network, and there's no way that we can do it without your support. So go over to patreon.com/TrekFM. You can see how you can be part of the team. Every little bit helps, but in the end, we just need your support. So go to patreon.com/TrekFM. Of course, you could find us on the Babel Conference there, over on Facebook. We're on Twitter at TrekFM, and we're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find us on Instagram at TrekFM. And if you would like to contact us, you can go to trek.fm/contact, choose a show, choose Literary Treks, and that comes to us. And, of course, we've got the Goodreads group that you could find, the Literary Treks Goodreads group. Just answer the questions and click join the group. And now, Bruce, if people did want to catch up with you and see what you've got going on, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Admiral_Rex and Instagram at just Admiral Rex, no underscore there. And I'm also occasionally on the Star Wars Report podcast. I'm going to be on an upcoming episode here soon. And then, of course, I'm with Dan Gunther doing Positively Trek, where we do Star Trek news, episode reviews, and, of course, books and comics over there, too. So we continue that, those kind of reviews, because there's so many books to cover and comics. There's more than enough to go around. And recently we had Adil Hussein, who plays Lieutenant Sahil from Discovery Season 3. He was on our show, and we've had a lot of good feedback on that. And so I think that's where I am. Yeah, that's about it.
Well, you could find me all over the place here on the network, of course, doing the 602 Club, which is our whole other side of the network. We've got the 602 Club show where we're talking about all of the fandoms we love. Of course, right now we've got John Mills and I doing Snyder Cuts there, too, where we're covering all of the directorial work of Zack Snyder as we lead up to his Justice League. You can also find me doing The Orb with Chris Jones, where we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And then I'm over on the Nerd Party Network doing a couple of shows. One is called Aggressive Negotiations. John Mills and I are talking about Star Wars each and every week. And then you could find me doing Owl Post, where Drea Kaufman and I are wrapping up our walk through the entire Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And of course, you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. But we want to say thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.